Hello friends, welcome to the Midnight Historian. I'm Lawrance Pembroke, keeper of tales and spark of forgotten times. Sit back and let's dive into the past together. If you enjoy these tales, please will you like and subscribe. It helps keep our stories alive. Join us for more journeys through time every week. This week, we peel back the layers of history to reveal why you would not survive the Middle Ages, a relentless era where survival hinged on more than mere luck. Picture a land gripped by disease, where the weak fell swiftly and even the strong faced trials unimaginable today. The clatter of swords, the stench of unwashed streets, and the constant threat of famine shaped every moment. As you brace yourself for this journey, consider the smallest details of daily life, details that could mean life or death in ways we scarcely fathom now. For example, bad breath may embarrass you today, but in the Middle Ages, it was deadly. With no toothbrushes and no toothpaste, cavities were the least of their problems. Swollen gums and blackened teeth made smiles terrifying. And what about dentist visits? Let's just say anesthesia wasn't an option. Imagine waking up to the sharp and pungent smell of damp hay mixed with the musty aroma of livestock. Not outside, not nearby, but right next to where you've been sleeping. The line between where humans lived and where animals were kept, practically non-existent. You'd struggle to breathe deeply as your nose adjusted to the filth caked into the walls and floor, mixed with the smell of your own body. There were no morning candles or sunlight streaming through glass windows to ease you into the day. More often than not, there weren't even windows at all, just wooden shutters with cracks so wide they let in the bitter draft of an endless winter or the buzzing invasions of flies during a sticky summer. As you open your eyes, all you'd see around you is shadows clinging to walls of rough, moldy timber or uneven stone. Your bed, if you could call it a bed, barely supports you. Instead of a plush mattress, you'd be lying atop a dense sack of straw, slowly breaking down and rotting. Straw wasn't a luxury either. It was an unfortunate necessity, and it came with its own host of problems. Nights are spent not just with a mattress, but with uninvited guests. Fleas, rats, and other pests easily made their homes in the soft filling under your back. Each morning, you'd wake with tiny red welts dotting your skin, the souvenirs of a persistent plague of bed bugs scavenging through the night. Cleanliness wasn't merely a neglected concept. It hadn't even entered the realm of possibility yet. Sheets? You'd have none. Coarse wool or burlap might cover you, washed rarely enough to hold its own musty bouquet. And what about that distinctive barnyard smell? You might think it was proximity to farmlands, but no, it was closer than that. Animals for most peasants weren't kept in separate barns. The family cow, sheep, or maybe a few pigs slept just feet away, adding body heat to chilly nights and saving a trip outside to feed them. This was considered practical, even smart, but it came at a cost. The priceless warmth came bundled with the unmistakable stench of waste, the low crunch of hooves on hay, and the constant dampness that clung stubbornly to the atmosphere. Space wasn't something to be divided between comfort and necessity. It was one shared, suffocating box. All of this makes modern comfort seem like miracles, doesn't it? Think about your memory foam mattress cradling you just right, or those soft linens freshly washed with the faint lavender scent of fabric softener. A quick question. When's the last time you had to think about vermin crawling over you while you slept? It's not just about comfort. It's about safety, peace of mind, and basic hygiene. A set of luxuries extremely rare in the medieval era. Those inventions we effortlessly overlook now, a cozy duvet or even the simple act of opening a window for fresh air, were utterly alien then. Instead, the thick walls of a medieval home trapped in all the bad odors and humid air, which over time piled onto the sense of grimy discomfort. This wasn't a matter of cleaning routines neglected for convenience. It was life itself, dirtier and harder than most of us can reasonably grasp. Why did it have to be this way? In short, necessity. The closest thing most medieval peasants had to modern sanitation was the hurried sweeping of a courtyard, often done with more focus on functionality than thoroughness. The livestock kept indoors weren't there by some twisted sense of masochism. They were economic lifelines. Grocery stores and food surpluses didn't exist for the poor. Anything you didn't raise, kill, or grow was a meal you wouldn't have. The fate of your family would be directly tied to those animals, so you really couldn't afford for a wolf or thief to make off with them overnight. Bringing them indoors wasn't just a practical convenience, it was survival. Another factor that defined the discomfort of these spaces was the near absence of light. Most homes lacked glazed windows, the kind we take utterly for granted now. Placing holes in walls meant sacrificing some protection from the cold, and glass itself was more costly than gold for the average medieval family. So many peasants lived in near constant twilight indoors. Keep in mind, insulation wasn't a thing either. Those cracks and gaps you didn't plug properly robbed much of the pitiful heat generated by humanity and animals huddling close. The damp air clung to the wooden surfaces and straw-blanketed floors, ensuring everything smelled earthy, except not in the pleasant sense. With such conditions, your day already felt heavy before it properly began. It wasn't just waking up, but dragging yourself up. Even simple movements, stretching your arms, pulling yourself to sit upright, forced you to reckon with the stiff ache running through your body. After all, a bed made from straw over dirt flattens into uneven pockets over time. Nights of laying wrong, curled up tight against the cold, would leave your joints groaning before your first yawn. For peasants, this wasn't laziness or avoidance. It was enduring physical strain that most modern comforts have now erased. Imagine reminding yourself every single morning that this is just life. There wouldn't be much point in aspiring to more. Then there was the psychological dread tied to this daily routine. Each morning promised its own series of potential horrors. You'd think of the long day ahead, already fatigued by the thought of endless, back-breaking physical labor. Whether fields needed tending, repairs had to be made, or food had to be prepared. Whatever awaited was rarely a task that would allow you to rest. And of course, few jobs avoided the filth or required anything close to clean conditions in this state of living. Waking up, therefore, didn't carry the crisp, hopeful refreshment it often does in modern times. It wasn't the promise of a new start, but rather the burdensome continuation of survival. Yet for all this, there was rarely an option to complain or resist. Part of this fortitude wasn't necessarily born of strength. It was born of time and its constraints. Life doesn't afford many pauses when you aren't guaranteed the next meal. Adapting swiftly to discomfort just became second nature. Have an ache, ignore it. Something smells, just breathe lighter. It wasn't going anywhere, and neither were you. This mental discipline could wear down even the most stalwart individuals. But in medieval times, there wasn't an alternative. All of these waking miseries were only the beginning. Think about the people first rising into this discomfort each morning. Calloused hands trying to warm up in the chill, shoulders stiff from a poorly supported night's sleep. Even getting to your feet without slipping on uneven, dirty floors required a level of mindfulness worth mentioning. These minor, commonplace inconveniences punctuated life regularly, joining a chorus of frustrations that ensured every day began in hardship. But rising from your bed was only the beginning. What happened next might make you miss the mattress. What if your morning bathroom routine involved an audience and a wooden bucket? The idea might make you cringe, but in medieval times, this was a normal start to the day for everyone, from peasant farmers to noble lords. Privacy as we know it didn't exist, and indoor plumbing was centuries away from being a reality. Instead, waste was managed, if you could call it that, with methods that left an unmistakable mark on the streets, the air, and unfortunately, the water. For most peasants, the toilet was a simple wooden bucket, often tucked behind the house or sometimes right inside the same shared space where the family slept and ate. The smell, predictable and ever-present. Once the bucket got too full, as it quickly did in crowded households, someone, usually a child, would be sent to empty it. But where would it go? Out the door and into the streets. Dumping waste directly onto dirt roads or narrow stone alleys was an everyday occurrence, no different than tossing out dishwater. People often warned passers-by with shouts of "Gardez-vous," a term derived from Old French, meaning "watch out for the water." The warning was helpful only to those quick enough to move out of the way. Unfortunately, it didn't do much to clean up the streets, which became thick with human waste, animal droppings, and every kind of refuse you can imagine. Walking through town required careful navigation, not only to avoid the muck underfoot, but also to sidestep the buckets coming from above. In many towns and cities, there were public latrines, but they weren't exactly a more hygienic option. These communal outhouses offered little in the way of ventilation or privacy. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers, you couldn't escape the stale, sour smell of waste that filled the air and clung to the damp walls. Flies buzzed incessantly, and once you sat down, there was no convenience of toilet paper to end the experience quickly. Instead, you'd have to rely on what was available, perhaps a handful of straw, some leaves, moss, or, if you were lucky, a frayed rag. It wasn't comfortable, nor was it particularly effective. In fact, the lack of proper wiping materials often led to the spread of bacteria and parasites, making an already unsanitary process even worse. Even those who lived in castles surrounded by stone walls and tapestries didn't escape this grim reality. Castles featured guard-robes, small chambers with seats that dropped waste straight into the moat below. While slightly more private than a bucket or public latrine, garderobes had flaws of their own. The waste that collected in the moats didn't simply disappear. It festered, creating a foul-smelling hazard that added to the castle's defenses in a way no one would envy. And believe it or not, these waste chutes were occasionally used by attackers as sneaky entry points during sieges. Imagine defending your home not just from swords and arrows, but from invaders climbing up through the very waste you discarded. It's a bizarre and grim practical detail of medieval living that's hard to forget. The sanitation challenges of the time went well beyond embarrassment or inconvenience. They created serious public health risks. Streets filled with waste weren't just unpleasant to walk through, they were breeding grounds for disease. During heavy rains, the mix of human and animal waste would wash into rivers and wells, contaminating the water supply. Since medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or how diseases spread, this contamination often went unaddressed. Drinking water was regularly tainted with dangerous parasites and pathogens, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses. This lack of clean water contributed to the reliance on beer or ale as the safer option for quenching thirst, but that came with its own set of effects, especially when consumed first thing in the morning. It's worth pausing to think about how this level of poor sanitation could affect everyday life. The stench alone would be inescapable, sticking to clothes, skin, and hair with no remedy beyond a rare bath. Flies, rats, and other pests thrived in these conditions, spreading even more disease. It created a vicious cycle. Unsanitary streets led to contaminated water, which led to sickness, which led to waste that perpetuated the problem. In the absence of germ theory, people simply accepted this as the way things were. They might have blamed foul-smelling air, known as miasma, for their illnesses, but they never connected the dots between poor sanitation and spreading disease. The consequences were devastating. High mortality rates, especially among children, could be traced back to these unsanitary practices. A simple stomachache could escalate into a deadly illness, and communities far and wide struggled to break free from the seemingly endless grip of sickness. For city dwellers, the sight of waste running freely through the streets was a daily reminder of what limited control they had over their environment. For rural peasants, the seemingly simpler life of managing a wooden bucket wasn't much better. The lack of infrastructure meant that everyone, regardless of location or status, was constantly battling the fallout from inadequate sanitation. Dumping waste into the open wasn't merely a symbol of primitive lifestyles. It was a window into a society with drastically different norms and priorities. Cleanliness wasn't a value celebrated in the way it is today. There were no detailed routines to sanitize hands or cover toilets properly. The efforts to keep a household running, feeding livestock, growing food and patching clothing, left little time to consider the implications of waste management. Beyond that, medieval people had no reason to believe their practices might be harmful. The concept of sanitation as we know it wouldn't emerge for centuries, and in its absence, daily life operated under conditions we'd now find unimaginable. While this all might sound deeply foreign to modern ears, it's worth remembering just how far we've come. Turning on a faucet, flushing a toilet, or stepping into a clean private bathroom. These are things most of us take for granted. They're such routine parts of daily life that the idea of living without them feels more like fiction than history. But for medieval people, navigating filthy streets and sharing public spaces without ventilation or proper tools, such conveniences would have been unfathomable luxuries. What all this points to is just how intertwined public health and infrastructure have become in defining the quality of life. The horrors of medieval sanitation stand as a stark reminder of what can happen when waste is mismanaged and cleanliness is undervalued. Diseases thrived not because of a single cause, but because every element of the system, water, waste, and living conditions, contributed to their spread. It was a world where survival depended less on knowledge or planning and more on pure luck. And if this routine wasn't enough to make you appreciate your morning bathroom break, just wait until you see what medieval breakfasts had to offer. Most mornings, after facing the bucket and the streets, a choice awaited. Stale bread, warm beer, or a watered-down bowl of something barely resembling soup. It wasn't just the sanitation that was grim, it was the food as well. Breakfast today might mean smoothies or scrambled eggs, but in 1325, it was a bowl of pottage and a mug of warm beer. Picture this: no sizzling bacon, no steaming coffee, no colourful spread of fresh fruits. Instead, you've just woken up in the cold and damp, sat down by the fire if you're lucky to have one, and there in front of you is a thick, gloopy stew and a drink that's more about survival than flavour. This was your energy source for the day ahead, and spoiler alert, it wasn't going to be a satisfying one. The medieval morning meal was utilitarian at best, and for most, it was grim and monotonous. Pottage, that gloopy stew, wasn't a delicacy. It was practicality in food form. Made from whatever might be left in a household store, it usually included grains, root vegetables, and maybe some beans. It was less of a recipe and more of an ongoing experiment. Imagine a pot simmering over the hearth for days or even weeks, with fresh ingredients tossed in as they became available and older bits sinking to form the bottom layer. A spoonful of this concoction depended heavily on the season and your resources. In summer, a handful of herbs might brighten the taste. In winter, you'd be lucky if the pottage hadn't frozen into a gelatinous block overnight. This humble stew was complemented by coarse bread, often made from barley or rye, grains considered too lowly for the wealthy who dined on refined wheat. That bread wasn't the fluffy golden loaf we picture today. It was dense and tough, often filled with unappetizing fillers like sawdust or acorns when times were hard. The result was a loaf that was more a challenge to eat than a source of joy. One account even describes this bread as being so hard it could deflect arrows. Cutting it wasn't the norm. Instead, you had to negotiate with it, tearing off chunks with effort and softening them in your pottage or beer just to make it edible. Now, about that beer. While a mug of warm weak ale might not sound like breakfast to us, it was absolutely essential in the Middle Ages. Water was hazardous. Wells and rivers were often tainted by human and animal waste, carrying parasites and diseases that could incapacitate or even kill. But beer, thanks to its brewing process, could save lives. Boiling the water during fermentation effectively purified it, making ale the safer choice. Even children drank it. The weak beer they were given had just enough alcohol to prevent pathogens from thriving, without being so strong as to impair them. When the water itself threatened your life, a warm mug of beer wasn't just practical, it was survival in a cup. Of course, there wasn't much variety in these meals. Day after day, year after year, pottage, bread and beer made up the backbone of the medieval diet for peasants and many working-class people. Meat and cheese were occasional treats, often reserved for Sundays or holy days when the local lord might grant a feast. Fresh fruits and vegetables weren't a guarantee either. These were strictly seasonal, appearing only in their prime months and often eaten quickly before they spoiled or turned into something else entirely, like fermented fruit wine. Spices could transform a bland meal into something memorable. But for the average peasant, even a pinch of pepper was out of reach. With cost equivalent to months of wages, spices remained locked behind the cupboards of the rich, making most medieval dishes taste, as some accounts suggest, like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. This lack of variety had consequences. Today, we might think of breakfast as fuel to kickstart the day, something energizing to keep us going. But medieval breakfasts didn't energize you. They just barely sustained you. The low nutritional value of pottage and bread, combined with the scarcity of protein or fresh produce, left people in a constant state of fatigue. It wasn't just the laborious lifestyle that drained them. It was the lack of proper fuel. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening immune systems and leaving many vulnerable to the endless cycle of illness that plagued medieval communities. Even the process of eating could reflect the realities of this harsh time. Meals weren't leisurely or social for the sake of enjoyment. A medieval breakfast wasn't laid out on a table with everyone enjoying their dish in harmony. For peasants, food was often eaten hastily and on the go, particularly when farm work beckoned at sunrise. Families often shared a single bowl of pottage, dipping bread into its murky depths or using crude wooden spoons. There was no assurance about hygiene. After all, basic cleanliness wasn't highly practiced, and hands dipped into food weren't always washed. Yet, despite all this, food was one of the few certainties in a medieval peasant's life. The monotony of pottage might not have been exciting, but it was reliable. When the harvest was good, when the grain stores were full, when the bread wasn't baked with fillers. These were days to savor, even if the meals themselves were humble. For the poor, survival was tied to the land and the food it provided, however meager. What wasn't consumed immediately was preserved, often salted or dried to last through the colder season. This meant that what little variety they might have enjoyed during the harvest months disappeared entirely in winter, replaced by the same root vegetables and stale grains eaten in endless rotation. For the upper classes, mornings at least offered slightly better options: eggs, milk, fresh cheeses and finer breads. But even these luxuries couldn't escape certain realities of medieval food preparation. Without refrigeration or consistent preservation methods, even the wealthiest households had to plan meals around what could be consumed before spoilage. And while knights and nobles may have had access to these luxuries, they weren't immune to the consequences of unsanitary conditions or waterborne illnesses. So, no matter where you were on the social ladder, breakfast was just another reminder of life's fragility. And let's not forget, even the beer wasn't exactly the comforting beverage we'd imagine today. The brewing techniques of the time weren't consistent, and what you sipped could vary wildly in taste. It was warm, likely flat, and heavily reliant on whatever grain or yeast was available locally. For children, this was their milk or juice, the drink they turned to at every meal simply because it was safe. That necessity paints a sobering picture of just how dangerous the untreated water could be, that even the youngest members of society couldn't escape it. What emerges from this portrait of medieval mornings is not just a sense of deprivation, but also endurance. Pottage, warm beer, and coarse bread weren't just breakfast. They symbolized the resilience of people making do with what little they had. Every meal was a gamble, and every bite carried the hope of seeing another day. With a belly full of beer and bread, it's time to get to work. But don't expect weekends off. For medieval peasants, labor started early, ended late, and took an unimaginable toll on mind and body. What if your workday started at dawn, ended at dusk, and never included a weekend? From the moment the sun crept over the horizon, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant toil. The idea of a weekend as we know it didn't exist. Your life revolved around the land, the seasons, and the never-ending list of tasks needed to survive. 6 days a week, the day had a simple rhythm. Work until you physically couldn't anymore, then sleep and repeat. The morning began early, often just as the first traces of light touched the fields. You'd trudge outside into the damp chill, yawning through the stiffness left by that patchy straw mattress from the night before. Before breakfast was even a thought, there were animals to feed and water to be fetched from a nearby stream or well. Carrying heavy buckets of water wasn't a quick errand. It was a repetitive chore that required strength and balance, and one that you'd repeat throughout the day. If you were lucky, you had an ox or donkey to help, the medieval equivalent of a modern tractor. If not, it was up to your own aching arms and back. Fieldwork dominated the day for most peasants, and the tools available didn't make it any easier. Imagine kneeling in the soil, gripping a wooden hoe that felt more like a splintered club, or swinging a rusty sickle over and over as sweat poured into your eyes. These were your only companions in the endless battle against weeds, or in breaking up stubborn, rocky soil. The job didn't wait for the weather's convenience either. In summer, the fields were ovens, baking you under the brutal sun while dust filled your mouth and nostrils. In winter, biting winds froze your fingers until every movement sent a dull ache through your hands. And yet, there was no too hot or too cold to take a day off. The land didn't care about your comfort. Planting, harvesting, or mending fences had to be done, no matter the season. Breaks were rare. Few workers had time to sit for long when a full day of tasks awaited. Your meals were eaten on the go or in the midst of your labor, often standing in the same spot where you'd been working. There weren't water bottles or refreshing snacks to keep you going, just a hunk of that hard, tasteless bread, or maybe some cold pottage if you hadn't polished it off the night before. And if the tools themselves weren't exhausting enough, the sheer repetition of motion, pulling weeds, carrying loads of grain, digging trenches, wore down the body in ways that left permanent reminders. Over time, as your spine begins to resemble the letter S, the cost of all this physical stress was almost unavoidable. Skinned knees, blisters, and aching joints were normal. Those who didn't survive into old age might have been spared the full damage, but for those who did, their twisted frames were visual proof of a lifetime dedicated to the grind. And this wasn't just men's work. Women were equally burdened, splitting their time between work in the fields and managing the household. For them, labor was an exhausting checklist that never ended. After planting crops or tending animals, women were expected to return home to spin wool, prepare meals, care for children, and haul water. Juggling these tasks wasn't a matter of choice. It was survival. Even children weren't spared, with many starting to contribute by as early as 5. Children, They start helping out around age 5, and from that point, their small hands were put to use pulling weeds, scaring off birds that threatened crops, or carrying smaller loads their parents couldn't spare time for. There was no concept of childhood as a time for play or education. Every member of the family had a role to fill, and failing to do so might mean less food on the table, or worse, no food at all. For those involved in trades outside farming, the grind was no easier. Blacksmiths, coopers, and tanners spent long hours in dangerous, poorly ventilated sheds. The work was hazardous. Fire, heavy tools, sharp metal, and injuries were frequent. A simple cut while working with raw hides in a tanner's shop could easily become infected, resulting in serious illness or worse. The perks of some trades included occasional bleeding, a grim reality for workers who had little protection. These tradesmen, while not toiling under the sun, faced their own set of constant challenges with no real sense of advancement. The pay was barely enough to scrape by and offered no cushion for emergencies. No matter where you worked, there was no escape from the weather. Homes offered little protection from the elements, meaning the physical strain of labor was compounded by the discomfort of your living conditions. In winter, the biting wind found every gap in the wooden walls or drafty stone structures, leaving work clothes stiff from frost. And in summer, the same dwellings trapped heat, turning homes into claustrophobic clay ovens. Clothing made from rough wool or linen added yet another layer of discomfort. A single tunic might last you months or years, itching constantly against your skin and rarely cleaned. Washing clothes and yourself took time and resources most peasants simply didn't have to spare. And what if you injured yourself out in the fields or during the day's work? The options for medical care were bleak. A twisted ankle or broken bone could mean you couldn't tend your crops, which wasn't just inconvenient, it was disastrous. There were no workers' compensation or safety nets. If you couldn't work, your family suffered alongside you. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever. Drink some warm beer and keep going. The advice sounds comically indifferent, but in reality it captures the grim reality peasants faced. Illnesses lingered far longer than they should have, and every scrape, cut, or bruise came with a risk of infection. With no hospitals or proper medication, you didn't rest when you got sick. You pushed through because there was simply no alternative. Despite all the effort, the reward barely felt worth it. The relentless labor rarely provided enough to live comfortably. Often, the yields from your land went straight to paying taxes or tithes to the local lord or church, leaving your family to survive on what little remained. It might be enough to fill your stomach on a good day, but there was no margin for error. A bad harvest, an illness that kept someone from working, or unexpected damage to your tools could create a spiral you might not recover from. Exhaustion, therefore, wasn't something unusual or occasional. It was the default state. The sheer amount of physical effort, coupled with the never-ending list of responsibilities, left no room for leisure or relaxation. For most, their only reprieve came on Sundays, when Mass provided a small break from the grind. Yet even then, religious observances often turned into another kind of work, whether praying for better harvests or confessing sins to ensure divine favor. The idea of resting for enjoyment, the way we think about weekends or vacations today, wouldn't have even crossed a peasant's mind. All this work didn't just define your time, it defined the value of your life. You weren't living to enjoy, to explore, or even to dream of something better. You were living to survive, and even that wasn't guaranteed. The repetition of it all, the unrelenting physical toll, created a life where the concept of rest was limited to short nights on scratchy straw or an occasional reluctant pause when absolutely necessary. And if the hard labor didn't wear you down, the lack of medical care certainly would. A cut that doesn't heal, a sickness that spreads, either could end your story before long. let's take a look at what medieval medicine had to offer, and how survival itself often depended less on treatment and more on sheer luck. Imagine a doctor diagnosing you by balancing your humors or leaching your blood to cure a headache. In the medieval world, medicine wasn't based on science as we know it. Instead, it was shaped by tradition, guesswork, and a framework that often caused more harm than good. The illnesses people faced were endless, but the remedies available were anything but effective. Seeking treatment wasn't just risky, it was its own kind of gamble, one where the stakes were often life or death. At the heart of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors. Physicians believed the body's health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was blamed on an excess or deficiency of one of these substances, and treatments focused on restoring their perfect harmony. For example, a fever might mean your blood had overheated. The solution? Bloodletting. A sore throat could suggest too much phlegm. Expect a concoction of herbs to purge your system. But without any real understanding of how the human body worked, these methods frequently caused more harm than healing. Instinctively, people turned to the best educated practitioners of the time, yet their knowledge rested on a theory that wasn't remotely connected to reality. Bloodletting was among the most common treatments. For this, you might visit a barber surgeon. The same person who cut hair also performed minor medical procedures. Using a dull blade or leeches, they drained blood from your body, believing it would clear the excess that was making you sick. This often caused significant blood loss, leaving patients weakened and pale, adding new complications to whatever illness brought them in the first place. The lack of sterilization was another huge risk. Tools weren't cleaned between patients, and leeches were reused until they practically fell apart. If the bloodletting didn't solve your problem outright, it might leave you with an infection or worse, hasten your decline. Barber surgeons didn't stop at bloodletting. They dabbled in a variety of medical tasks, everything from extracting rotten teeth to amputating infected limbs. Surgery at the time was rudimentary, to say the least. Anesthesia hadn't been invented, meaning every procedure was done while the patient was fully conscious. The pain was unimaginable. Bone saws, crude knives, and iron tools were heated over flames, not for sterilization, but simply to stop the bleeding once the injury became too severe. Surgeries often resulted in infections that rapidly turned fatal. Without antibiotics, even a minor wound could spiral out of control, leading to sepsis. Surgery wasn't a first choice. It was often a desperate last measure for conditions already nearing the point of no return. For those who avoided the barber surgeon altogether, herbal remedies were the go-to treatment. Many plants held medicinal properties, and certain concoctions could offer relief for minor aches or fevers. But these remedies weren't rooted in rigorous testing. A combination of superstition and limited empirical observation guided their use. You might be offered mashed beetles to ease pain, or a poultice of dubious origin applied to an infected wound. While some herbal treatments helped, others were ineffective or outright harmful. Without a real grasp on how to prevent infection or diagnose diseases, medieval medicine frequently got in its own way. Understanding of diseases was non-existent. Since germ theory was centuries away, people didn't know what caused illness. Instead, explanations ranged from bad air, a concept known as miasma, to sin, divine punishment, or curses. Treatment often included not only physical remedies but also spiritual ones. Clergy members were frequently involved in healing, and prayer was seen as an important part of recovery. Illness wasn't just viewed as a physical ailment, it was a moral and spiritual failing. Those suffering were sometimes blamed for their own conditions, with leprosy and plague being particularly stigmatizing. Fear of contagion meant that people with visible or severe illnesses risked being ostracized by their communities. Once shunned, survival became an even steeper uphill battle. High mortality rates were to be expected in a world with such limited medical knowledge. Infant mortality was shockingly common, with many children dying before their 5th birthday. Women faced extreme danger in childbirth, with common complications often proving fatal. Accidents in fields or workshops left men and women alike at the mercy of rudimentary treatments, and during outbreaks of disease, entire villages could be wiped out. The best-known example is, of course, the Black Death. When the plague ravaged Europe, it killed as much as 1/3 of the population. Remedies to combat it ranged from ineffective herbal mixtures to bizarre rituals like burning aromatic herbs or whipping oneself in an attempt at divine forgiveness. Medicine offered little hope in the face of such a relentless killer. The social side of healthcare, or the lack of it, painted its own grim picture. Medicine was a luxury most peasants couldn't afford. Wealthier individuals had access to physicians, but the outcomes were hardly better in many cases. Barber surgeons tended to the majority of the population, and while they could be resourceful, their training was minimal at best. There was no licensing, no system to verify their skills, and no way to guarantee that the person treating your illness hadn't just been trimming beards. For peasants, it often came down to watching a loved one suffer at home, experimenting with whatever herb grew nearby and hoping for the best. Learning about anatomy was rare. Dissecting human bodies was often illegal, as the church strictly regulated what could and couldn't be done with corpses. This left medieval physicians with only surface-level knowledge, gleaned mostly from ancient texts rather than hands-on observation. The result was a medical tradition that clung stubbornly to outdated ideas even as they failed time and time again. It wasn't until centuries later, as universities grew and scientific methods advanced, that these ideas were truly challenged. To survive illness in the Middle Ages, you needed more than good medicine. You needed sheer luck, a resilient body, and perhaps divine intervention. For every patient who recovered, countless others didn't. A cough could become pneumonia, a cut could end in sepsis. And even if you managed to recover, another challenge was always just around the corner, whether it was malnutrition, another bout of disease, or an injury waiting to happen. But even if you survived illness, your daily meals might still be a death sentence. Contaminated food was a hidden danger lurking in every meal, and the risks of eating in medieval times went far beyond just surviving on stale bread or warm beer. What if your daily bread was laced with sawdust or a deadly fungus? In the Middle Ages, something as simple as a loaf of bread could turn from a staple to a silent killer. Bread wasn't just a convenience, it was the backbone of survival, eaten every day and by nearly everyone. But if the harvest failed, if the grains were contaminated, or if clever but unethical hands decided to stretch a batch further, the very thing that was meant to nourish could take life instead. Picture breaking into a piece of bread only to find it unnaturally gritty, its flavor flat and sour. That grim texture might not come from coarsely ground grain, but from fillers like bark, clay, or even sawdust. Hard to imagine sitting down to a meal like this, right? But for a family facing an empty grain store, stretching flour became the only way to survive a long winter or another poor harvest. These fillers didn't just rob the bread of nutrients, they added their own risks, introducing harmful contaminants into an already fragile diet. The bread could become so dense and tough that it earned grim nicknames like stone bread, reflecting both its unappetizing nature and its ability to wreak havoc on the stomach. And if that wasn't bad enough, there was another invisible danger, one far more sinister: ergot. Rye bread, common among peasants, was especially susceptible to a fungus called ergot, which thrived in damp or improperly stored grain. Consuming even small amounts could lead to ergotism, a condition marked by violent convulsions, hallucinations, and eventually death. Some referred to it as saint, Anthony's fire. a name that doesn't quite capture the full horror of the experience. Imagine entire villages struck down at once, with people writhing and screaming, convinced they were cursed or possessed. Modern research has even compared ergot poisoning to a primitive form of LSD and tetanus, creating a nightmarish cocktail of symptoms. Of course, bread wasn't the only danger on the medieval plate. With little understanding of foodborne illnesses or safety, the risks lurked everywhere. Fresh food was seasonal, which meant much of what people ate in colder months had to be preserved. Meat was salted or smoked, vegetables were dried or fermented, and fruits, too delicate to last, often turned to mush long before they reached the table. Preservation helped food last longer, but it wasn't foolproof. Spoiled meat, for instance, might still find its way into a stew after being rinsed or cooked heavily in hopes of masking the smell. And if the meat didn't kill you, the lack of variety in the diet might. Monotony in meals left most peasants malnourished, weakened, and vulnerable to disease. But the limited access to fresh ingredients wasn't just about the natural growing seasons. It was also a symptom of social inequality. Fresh meat, for example, was incredibly rare for the average peasant. In addition to its cost, laws restricted who could hunt and where. These poaching laws were more than just guidelines. They were weapons of control. Game animals like deer, rabbits, and even some birds belonged to the lords of the land. Hunting them without permission could result in severe punishment, from heavy fines to imprisonment or, in extreme cases, execution. For peasants, this made a vital source of protein unattainable, locking them into cycles of physical labor fueled by little more than bread and pottage. Speaking of pottage, this stew-like dish was the centerpiece of most peasant meals, and its quality varied wildly depending on what ingredients were on hand. In good times, it might include a splash of milk, a hint of bacon fat, or even a few wild herbs. But in harder seasons, which were plentiful in medieval life, it was little more than grains boiled with root vegetables. What made pottage so risky wasn't just its humble ingredients, but the fact that it often simmered in a pot for days or even weeks. New ingredients were tossed in as they became available, but the older portions remained, festering at the bottom. Without refrigeration, this slow cooking method, an ongoing edible experiment, as one account puts it, was a breeding ground for bacteria. Even milk, something we think of as simple and safe, posed its own unique dangers. Without refrigeration, fresh milk spoiled within hours, especially in warmer months. Cheese and butter, longer lasting by design, were loaded with bacteria due to the unhygienic processes used to make them. And yet, dairy products were a rarity for many, treats to be savored sparingly, so most families relied on hard odds or limited resources to prepare and consume them. The laws and systems of the time made it crystal clear. The food you ate wasn't just shaped by your skill at farming or foraging. It was dictated by the circumstances of class and power. Spices, which could mask the taste of spoiled food and elevate an otherwise bland dish, were worth more than gold. Common families couldn't come close to affording pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg. Instead, the wealthy hoarded these luxuries, flaunting them not only as a marker of flavor, but as a statement of dominance. For peasants, flavor came from onions, salt, or maybe garlic, if they were lucky. Blandness wasn't just a culinary failing, it was a mirror of the strict hierarchies embedded in medieval life. In every bite, you were reminded of your place. Beyond the dangers of what they ate, medieval people also suffered from what they drank. Beer was the default beverage, safer than the water that teemed with parasites and filth. But drinking beer all day came with its own challenges. The brewing methods of the time were inconsistent, resulting in drinks that could vary wildly in taste and safety. Occasionally, barrels would spoil or mold, but out of necessity, the beer might still be consumed. It wasn't about enjoying the taste, it was about staying alive. All of this paints a grim picture of medieval dining. Every meal had the potential to harm you, whether through contamination, malnutrition, or illness. And yet, food wasn't just a source of physical sustenance, it was also deeply tied to power. Lords and royalty dined in banquet halls on lavish feasts, while the rest scraped by on thin stews and hard bread. In the rare times of celebration, a feast for a saint's day, for example, peasants might get a taste of that life in the form of small scraps or shared portions. Even in these moments, though, the gap between them and their rulers was impossible to ignore. This constant struggle for survival made eating an act of endurance. Bread, once moldy, became stale. Pottage grew sour in the pot. Dinner was for many the same as breakfast and lunch. Food represented life's fragility, its ability to sustain, yes, but also its power to take away. Each bite was a reminder not only of how hard it was to keep living, but how very little was within the eater's control. And yet, there was always the potential for something worse. If the food didn't kill you, the violence of the times might. In an age ruled by fear, punishment, and constant conflict, even a basic trip through town could turn deadly. Let's look at the everyday risks of living in a world so frequently defined by brutality. What if stealing a loaf of bread cost you your hand, or worse? In medieval society, the response to crime wasn't subtle, and it definitely wasn't kind. Justice was harsh, swift, and often brutal, a system built more on fear than fairness. Every punishment, no matter how severe, carried a double message. One for the punished and one for the crowd watching. Whether it was a petty theft or a serious crime, the consequences were designed to leave an impression, physically, emotionally, and socially. This was a world where violence wasn't just a possibility, it was woven into daily life. Walking through a medieval town, you'd be surrounded by reminders of what breaking the law might cost you. Stocks and pillories in the town square held those who had been caught in minor crimes, perhaps slander or theft, leaving them vulnerable to public humiliation. Onlookers would jeer and throw rotten food or stones, turning punishment into a form of communal entertainment. For more serious crimes, the consequences were far graver. A thief could lose a hand, a liar might have their tongue pierced, and even modest infractions could result in mutilation. These punishments weren't random, they were calculated, designed to serve both as retribution and as a clear warning to others. If you stole, you'd be forever marked as a thief, not just by reputation, but by the missing hand that made your crime impossible to hide. The sheer unpredictability of medieval justice fueled the fear it thrived on. Since centralized legal systems didn't truly exist, most cases fell under the authority of local lords or other figures in power. The punishment you received often depended less on what you did and more on who judged you. This made for an inconsistent and chaotic system where personal grudges, biases, or bribes could shape your fate. Was the Lord in a bad mood? Did he want to make an example of you? Justice was rarely blind, and it certainly wasn't impartial. But even those punishments pale in comparison to the public executions. These weren't quiet affairs held in enclosed spaces. They were spectacles, as much performance as punishment. Hangings, beheadings, and the occasional burning were carried out in front of large crowds. People gathered enthusiastically, treating the event as a grim form of entertainment. The execution wasn't just a somber moment of justice being carried out. It was a chance for the community to both satisfy their curiosity and reinforce their collective understanding of right and wrong. The condemned didn't simply die. They were put on display. A beheading wasn't just about the swift removal of a head, it was a carefully orchestrated warning, intended to etch the ultimate consequences into every witness's mind. On top of these direct acts of violence, there was another quieter form lurking in the background: domestic violence. Behind closed doors, physical harm wasn't just common, it was expected, particularly within certain roles. Husbands were encouraged, and often even expected, to discipline their wives and children. The patrimonial structure of medieval life meant that authority didn't simply rest with the state or the church. It extended deep into the family unit as well. The violence that shaped public life echoed in private spaces, creating a cycle that perpetuated harm and normalized cruelty. If you were on the wrong end of someone's temper, the community was far less likely to intervene than to shrug it off as a private matter. Daily public life outside the home wasn't much better. Street fights were frequent, and brawls could erupt over the smallest slights. A casual glance in the wrong direction or an unintentional shove in a narrow market alley might spark an altercation. For peasants, these fights often came with the risk of serious injury. There wasn't much recourse for victims aside from nursing wounds and moving on, assuming, of course, that the injuries weren't severe enough to kill. And this was before even factoring in the clash of egos or disputes that could escalate into feuds involving entire families. Swords and knives weren't just worn for ceremony or work. Carrying a weapon meant assuming that at any moment you might need to defend yourself. And then there were the larger scale dangers, raids, wars and crusades. Warfare was almost a constant backdrop to medieval life. Local skirmishes between feuding lords could escalate rapidly, spilling over into nearby villages. Armies would trample through fields, set fire to homes, and cut down anyone who resisted. No explanation, no apologies. Larger religious wars like the Crusades mobilized entire nations, dragging countless civilians into their fiery wake. These conflicts didn't merely happen on the distant horizon. They swept directly through communities, leaving destruction in their path. For ordinary people, the line between war and peace was faintly drawn and easily erased. A quiet spring morning might turn into a scene of carnage by midday, and preparation for such invasions wasn't so much a question of if as it was when. The omnipresence of violence dictated not only how people behaved, but how they thought. Life was fragile, and anyone could become a victim at any moment. Neighbors could turn violent over land disputes. Enemies, both foreign and domestic, made their presence known through plunder and bloodshed. The constant threat forced communities into a state of near-permanent vigilance. Trust wasn't just earned, it was guarded and conditional. Few bonds were strong enough to guarantee security in a world where violence was both normal and necessary. Survival required more than physical strength. It required awareness, cunning, and the ability to anticipate the worst at all times. And if external threats weren't hazardous enough, justice could be so arbitrary it felt like a threat of its own. Trial by ordeal was a common practice, relying on divine intervention to determine guilt or innocence. Imagine being forced to retrieve a stone from the bottom of a cauldron of boiling water. If your hand didn't blister and somehow healed quickly, you might be deemed innocent. If it became infected or you fell ill, the gods had spoken and your guilt was proclaimed. Another method was the water test. The accused would be tossed into a river. If they floated, they were guilty, because the water supposedly rejected them. If they sank, their innocence might be proclaimed, but often they'd drown before they were pulled out. These trials weren't designed for fairness, they were cruel tests of endurance and chance. And hanging over it all was the immense power of the church. Accusations of heresy or witchcraft were among the most dangerous charges anyone could face. The punishment for these crimes was extreme, often culminating in execution by burning or drowning. In these cases, violence wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about reinforcing religious control. Church leaders wielded as much authority as kings or lords, and their decisions could carry enormous weight. Innocence mattered less than appearances, and once suspicion fell on someone, there was little hope of escape. This network of brutality shaped medieval life on every level, embedding itself into the culture and routines of daily existence. People lived with constant reminders, scarred hands, public executions, fire-scarred fields, that survival wasn't just about avoiding starvation or illness. It meant preparing for the constant, lingering threat of violence that never seemed too far away. And through all of this, life was short, brutal, and unrelenting. Beyond wars and punishments, the fight for survival continued, marked by diminishing years and an unpredictable future. The Middle Ages weren't just a time of knights and castles. They were a daily fight for survival. Life hinged on battling filth, disease, and harsh conditions, while the comforts we take for granted today, clean water, fresh food, warm homes, were unimaginable luxuries. Every meal, every step in a muddy street, every sunrise brought uncertainty and risk. Next time you enjoy a hot shower or crisp fresh bread, remember how far we've come and how much we take for granted. History may be harsh, but it's also a reminder of human resilience, and maybe, just maybe, a reason to be grateful for modern life.